people can listen. Thank you, Becky, for getting the recording started. Hello, I am Rachel Smith, a collections archivist at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Welcome to the August SERI webinar, Taking a Bite Out of BitCurator. We love to use a pun. I'm here representing the SERI Education and Programming Subcommittee, which is a larger committee, but I don't remember the name of the larger committee. So Education Outreach is what I'm aware of. Oh, there's a few more people who have joined us, which is great. And I want to draw attention to some upcoming webinars that we are having. In October, we will be celebrating Electronic Records Day with a webinar focusing on metadata. So you can go ahead and get registered for that. And also want to highlight that the COSA annual meeting will be happening in St. Louis next month, which is very soon and very exciting. So I think there are still seats available for that. So if you're interested in joining us in St. Louis next month, look for both of information about both of these events on the COSA website. Speaking of also on the website, these are links to some resources. This webinar and then most of our webinars, if they're not discussion-based webinars, are recorded and available later on YouTube if you would like to look at them. And then also just always explore the Resource Center for items from your fellow state archives colleagues and things like that. Also want to thank our 2024 sponsor, Preservica, for providing financial support that allows us to have these educational opportunities. And welcome to our lovely presenters today. First, we have Krista Sorensen, who works as the Electronic Records and Digital Preservation Archivist for the Wisconsin Historical Society. From 2022 through 24, she served on the BitCurator Consortium's as Executive Council and currently participates in the BCC's Document and Training Committee. Prior to her work at WHS, Krista managed digitization projects at the State Library of North Carolina and assisted local government records management at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Tara Maharjan is an electronic records archivist for the New Jersey State Archives. She holds master's degrees from Simmons College in History and Library Science with a concentration in archives, as well as the Society of American Archivists Digital Archives Specialist Certificate. Before working at the State Archives, she worked for Rutgers University's Special Collections and University Archives, the Internet Archive, and as a cookbook librarian for America's Test Kitchen. She is a relatively new user of BitCurator. And finally, we have Grant Robertson, who is an electronic records archivist at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History since 2021, where he currently manages the digitization, electronic records, and technical services division. He received his MLIS from the University of South Carolina with a specialization in archives and preservation. Prior to his work at SCDAH, he has led teams of QA, web, and mobile app developers at various companies, operated a public darkroom and camera store, and has been a video producer and photographer for 20 years. He has been using BitCurator for the past 2 years and has performed multiple installs, accidental deletions, and reinstalls. Brunhilde is his favorite piece of software on BitCurator, which I find is a fun fact that you always need to share at parties what your BitCurator tool of choice is. So thank you, wonderful presenters today. So the way this is going to work is that I have a list of questions and I'm going to have our panelists each respond. I think I'm going to go in a round robin. We'll do Krista, Tara, Grant, and then Tara, Grant, just for each question so everyone can respond. So for this first question, I'll start with you, Krista. Can you just share some background about how long you've been using BitCurator and how you use it at your institution?
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. So WHS are both users of the BitCurator environment and members of the BitCurator Consortium. And we've been that since about 2015, 2017, when during our NHPRC grant that helped us develop our electronic records program, we had people on staff, including my predecessor, who had experience with BitCurator, during her time at UNC Chapel Hill, and then when she came to WHS and we were developing workflows, she advocated that we use it and become members of the consortium and participate. I've been with WHS since 2020, so really my BitCurator use has been since about 2020. And I only sporadically use the environment because it's not actually, despite all that, what I just said, really built into our workflows in our everyday use cases of processing electronic records. I've mostly been using it for the special cases when I have external media formatted in Mac or Linux environments, and when I need to convert file format. So I know it has a lot of forensic capabilities, but there are other tools that I use for that I can get to a little easier sometimes, which we'll get into later than BitCurator. But it's more sporadic use for us right now. But I'm always curious and interested in why I'm glad to be part of this today to hear how other people are using it, because yeah, I know there's so much more I could do. I'll pass along to Tara then.
Thanks, Krista. So I started with the New Jersey State Archives in December of 2022 and was tasked with my colleague Danny Marchetti to create an electronic records program. We didn't have one in the state of New Jersey. We needed to create it. And we had Preservica already, but we needed to create the workflow of how all of that was going to happen. So for us, we debated whether we wanted to get like a Fred machine or something along those lines to kind of help with our work. But ultimately we decided that a Linux computer with BitCurator was going to be a better option for us. It would allow us to change out parts of the computer if we needed to, versus a Fred machine, which was going to be pretty set of what we were going to be able to do with it. And unlike Krista, like we built BitCurator into our workflow. And so again, not to jump ahead, but we can talk a little bit more about, how we're kind of doing those things as we move forward. So Grant, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so I've been using BitCurator for about 2 years now. I inherited ownership of using BitCurator when our electronic records processing archivist left the agency a couple years ago. And to mirror a lot of what Krista said, is that we use it like fairly sporadically because there are some use cases that like don't make total sense for us to use it all the time. But I have spent months at a time, neck deep, in BitCurator, trying to figure out how it all fits together and sort of troubleshooting things, sometimes over and over again. I think that, again, I don't want to get ahead too much of everything else, but I about 2 years on and off, and it's probably been about 6 months since I've really been in it and used it in a non-exploratory kind of way, where I was just trying to get in and get out with a very specific task. And that's all I've got. And we're using a virtual machine on a cannibalized PC that we just found in a closet.
Okay, great. That gives really, I think, good context for, just so some of you have touched on this a little bit, and you guys all, are in your positions in the last couple of years. And so when you entered this position, you said some of you guys inherited, some of you, obviously Tara, you guys built it from the ground up, but like, did you have training or documentation to learn the system? If not, what resources have you found useful for the learning curve of learning the system, if you've inherited or as you are building it out into your workflow? Starting with Tara.
So we started using BitCurator at an odd time, which was when BitCurator kind of did a major upgrade. And so a lot of the documentation that we found online were all old. Some of the programs kind of stayed the same, but some of the things were drastically different. There were things that were telling me that there were GUIs for that I could not find or had, wouldn't work with the updated version of other programs. So we were a little frustrated with that, but we had the distinct advantage of being part of the backer grant. So we were working with Nick Canizzo to create our workflow. So we had a built-in sounding board to be like, hey, is this what I'm actually supposed to be getting? Because that was another big part of it, was learning to do learning BitCurator, and especially with command line things. Sometimes I was like, I just don't know what my final product is supposed to look like. What am I supposed to be getting out of this? And so having Nick be able to at least tell me, yes, this is like what it's supposed to do, versus like you're getting an error, like it's not running properly, you're getting some kind of error, and trying to figure it out with us was very helpful. And I will say he helped us write a lot of kind of documentation to get us started, which will be available through the backer grant. So he will be putting out some of the documentation that he wrote to help us get started. So that's more to come from Nick. Grant, off to you.
Yeah. Well, so I can relate a lot to what you're talking about, Tara. I originally, the install that we had of BitCurator originally, I think was like in the 2 point something version, and nobody had updated it in probably 3 years. So there were a lot of I got in there initially and said, oh wow, there's a lot of really interesting programs, and then BitCurator crashed, and I was not able to recover the VM. I finally got it up and running again, and then the entire computer died because it was also about 10 years old. So then when I finally got a fresh install and was following through the documentation, like a couple months later, there was a new version that had like just been released. But I had a couple of like stops and starts in terms of installing it and getting the settings just right. But honestly, the biggest piece of training, or the biggest like piece of documentation that I really relied on, was there was like a Confluence page on a Educopia site. I don't think that exists anymore. Maybe it does. But since then, I know that the BitCurator Consortium has created a lot of good documentation that is posted on their like GitHub Docs site. And the other thing I found that was like really helpful in learning more about what the features are supposed to look like, or what you're supposed to do, was using the Google community for BitCurator. You can search through there and find a lot of answers to questions that are basic enough that you don't I don't know. And if you don't find an answer, you can of course ask one. And the community seems to be really nice in terms of either responding or pointing to other resources. And Krista, I'll pass it on to you.
Sure. So I've learned how to use it mostly through trial and error. When I joined WHS, I was left with some minor like internal documentation, which listed some of the tools that could be the most useful in processing. This includes Skymager, bulk extractor, bulk reviewer, file access, HFS Explorer, Brunhilde, and LibreOffice, which again, for those who may or may not know, BitCurator are like a suite of tools, like a bunch of like open source tools that have been cobbled together, or not cobbled, but like brought together in this one environment for people to do this type of forensic digital work on digital collections, right? And it is run by the BitCurator Consortium, pulled together, managed by the BitCurator Consortium, which was and it still is currently hosted by Educopia. So that's why Grant found that Confluence site on from Educopia, because BitCurator is affiliated there. They had to, again, this is like me being part of the executive council sharing knowledge right now, had to switch from Confluence to GitHub. So yes, the most current, if anyone's looking for it, like documentation is going to be on that GitHub docs page. And yes, to Tara's point, like they released a new like updated environment, did all the updates to it, but the documentation has not kept up at pace with that environment. It is actively being worked on, but it's slow. and totally acknowledge that. And because this is all volunteer-based open source organization, right? So people are contributing what time they have to keep it running. So it can be frustrating. I acknowledge that. I have felt it myself as much as I'm a part of it and on the documentation and training committee. But you know, it's part of the game, right? With open source documentation. So I also, like Grant, have relied on the Getting Started guide, which again, now on the GitHub site for BitCurator. And yeah, the users forum, I haven't, or Google group haven't really like touched on it much, but I do know that it's a good resource. I also have attended the BitCurator users forum, which is their like 3-4 day conference, which is open to folks. And it's less like hands-on training a lot of times and more just, again, like sitting there, hearing what other people are doing and using BitCurator for, which I find helpful just to like learn. And then as consortium members, there's community calls, which can be helpful in this regard, but not always. Like, you know, they're interesting topics, kind of like these webinars. You know, sometimes they're really helpful for you. Other times, you know, it's like an interesting topic that you would want to sit in on. So it's, you know, for me, trial and error, playing around with it. Thankfully, not crashing it as much as Grant has, but maybe that would be good for me as well, right? And we are also, I should have mentioned too, in a virtual environment on a VM on a Windows machine. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. So starting with Grant, I'm going to ask, can you provide examples of some of the biggest benefits you have found with the suite of tools? Or, you know, biggest wins, biggest successes, things that have been the pros, essentially.
For sure. One of, you know, I did, it wasn't really a joke. Brunhilde really is probably my favorite program on there. It's easy to use for the most part, and you know, it outputs a really nice report that people that don't work in BitCurator can actually look at and sort of process. And provides a lot of like really helpful exports, like CSVs of suspected duplicates. I think there are like, I have my like small gripes about little things throughout, but that's also not BitCurator. That's a separate kind of you know, program that's just included. But one of the other big features that I really like is the read PST program. And that allows you to actually decode a PST into an mbox format. And again, like, there's tons of problems whenever you're decoding a PST file or trying to migrate it to another format, just because they're messy files in general. But I was having a lot of difficulty finding any programs outside of ReadPST that were free and included in some other software and had any kind of documentation. And it's, again, like pretty simple to use if you're familiar with the command line. And that has helped our workflow a lot in terms of email processing. So maybe that's a subject for, you know, another webinar. But those two programs are like really stand out to me. Outside of it just being in a sort of protected environment where, you know, sort of a walled garden where people can learn Linux and command line programs sort of freely and not have to worry about, you know, destroying an entire computer because usually it's inside of a virtual machine, or it's in a machine that if something does go wrong, you can just reimage it. So like in Tara's case, I think that that's probably, you know, an option. And I'm not sure who gets the next bit here. So I'll pass it back to Rachel.
I think it might be me.
Okay.
Good. I mean, a thumbs up from Rachel. So my biggest benefit is that increasingly my IT environment is locked down, which I think is the case for everyone across state government. And, you know, in many ways I understand that. In other ways, it makes my job frustrating, right? Since so much of what I do is just electronic. It's in the computer. It's digging into weird files and other things, right? And so working in the Linux machine, our virtual machine and then it being a Linux environment, it does provide me a little bit more freedom and flexibility, just like Grant was saying, to play around with some command line, try things out, try out tools, test out open source software that I, can dig into. So not, I have the approval from IT to have this BitCurator and virtual machine and environment. So I'm not like completely skirting like all the rules, but sometimes it feels like it, right? Because I do have access in a weird way to that Linux environment. And so much when you are looking online at open source tools, at documentation, people are talking about command line, talking about code, talking about, do this, it's this easy Linux setup. And so having BitCurator and the environment is a good benefit. And there are some tools, I kind of echo the read PST comment that Grant made as well. Like I played around with it as much, not as much as it sounds like to like fully process things, 'cause I'm still figuring out how we want to process email, but it's been good to know that that's there. And really like biggest wins too are, again, using LibreWriter's command line to convert file formats, especially on really old files that I've gotten off of floppy disks. And so if there's been a lot, and there's sometimes have been a lot like that I need to convert, instead of opening every single one, or, to like convert, save as a different file format, doing it in the command line in LibreWriter and BitCurator has been like a great fallback, especially because, like I said before, it's not baked into our full total workflows. So I'm sure Tara's examples are going to be a little different than ours, but for my sporadic use, like those have been the big ones. But I'll let Tara expand.
So yeah, Krista, you're right. Like we mainly use it to run reports. And so we use, we've been trying to use GUIs as much as possible because we don't feel as comfortable with the command line. Part of it is also just us feeling more comfortable in the BitCurator environment, but right now we feel very safe using the Brunhilde GUI. And Brunhilde will do a lot for us, but we do run a number of reports that we then give to our collection management team, who use it for appraisal and for the like accessioning materials, and also to kind of help create some kind of container lists from like the file manifests that we are generating. So we're making the most of it, but that is part of every collection we're working with. We're running it through BitCurator just to even get these reports to help us with our processing. And it's just it's what's working for us right now. And again, we're still a fairly new program. And so we'll see as we keep scaling up if this will continue to be how we're doing things. But for right now, we are using BitCurator for almost everything.
Okay, great. Some of your responses made me think of some other questions, but we'll continue on and we'll circle back to some things. On the opposite end, starting with Krista, I'm going to ask, can you give examples of major roadblocks or cons or issues that you have faced using the suite of tools?
Yeah, I think as much as I just praised it, that it's a virtual environment and that I can do what I want in it, it's also a major roadblock to me, and part of why I haven't built it into my everyday workflows for all of my processing, right? Because I have to use the virtual machine, which is separate and not integrated to the network really. And so if I want to work in it, I have to mount external media directly to the virtual environment, which sometimes I'm successful at and other times I'm not. I always have to like re-educate myself on how to do that. And then, or other times, if it's already off of the media, but I still want to work on it, then I have to copy files over to a folder that's shared on the desktop that shares with the virtual environment to do what I want. And then again, once I'm done, copy all that work back over to where I have it stored in our network, right? So it just takes more time. It's more loopholes to hula hoops or whatever the words are to like jump through to like get to do the thing, which is why I haven't like built out. And I have other tools that are not in the virtual environment that do work on Windows that I can rely on to do a lot of the other kind of processing things, since we've built out those workflows without like fully integrating BitCurator. And I just, as I'm sure other people do, like don't have enough time to sit there and figure it out and build it out. And you know, we aren't building our program right now. It's me like maintaining our program and like adjusting our program and you know, doing 10 other things for my job, because we all have multiple duties in our jobs, right? So I don't really have a lot of tools, and I'm not also not like, as much as I was like, yeah, it allows me to play with the command line and I can do the one thing to like convert the files for the command line, is because I found that. I didn't create it myself. I found it to do it and it works. And I'm grateful for that, but it's like the one thing I know how to do. So like, because the documentation can be limited and the training is not necessarily out there, it takes more time for me to like learn and do things with it and get even more comfortable with command line. Or if there is a GUI, like figure out what the GUI is even doing and what buttons I need to push and things like that. So it's great that it's a virtual machine, but it's also like a roadblock that it's a virtual machine for me. Tara?
So it's funny because so mine is a standalone Linux machine. And my major roadblock is IT. And so when we decided that we wanted an actual machine, one, I had to convince my IT department to allow me to buy a separate computer. And the big issue with that was actually the fact that I was telling them I wanted it to have limited network connectivity. And they actually freaked out because they wanted it connected to the network, because they wanted to push updates and things to it. And I was like, no, there's like security issues for that. And we went back and forth. They finally agreed to let me have the computer. They installed Linux for me, but they installed it incorrectly. So when I went to go install BitCurator, I was having problems with some of the things because it was incorrectly installed. So that was a problem. And then when they dropped the computer off to my office, they just dropped it off and I said, do you know how to use Linux? And I was like, kind of. And they're like, okay, great. You have no IT support. We do not support Linux. This is on you now. Goodbye. And the man literally ran out of my office. So, I mean, it's good and bad. I mean, it does mean that I do have complete administrative control over this computer. But a lot of the things do fall to me. And so that can be a bit of an issue. That we need to kind of work through. Luckily, we have not had any issues at this point. But when I do have problems, I will be coming back to the SERI community and be like, so who can help me with this? Because there isn't anyone in my IT who is willing to help, because it's not a standard Windows computer. Grant?
Yeah. Typically, like the problem that I sort of like continually have is that I figure out a good workflow for BitCurator and I use it consistently for a couple of weeks. And then the virtual machine starts running out of memory because I didn't quite set up the memory allocation the right way, or just the computer itself is limited in terms of hard drive space, not even RAM, just like actual hard drive space. 30 minutes, I mean, not 30 minutes, about a couple hours ago, I went and actually just said, oh, I haven't opened up BitCurator in a while. Let me go see what's going on. So I tried to just open any folder, and it was next to and this is in the Windows environment. Nothing was refreshing, and I checked the memory, and I was down to, I think, 30 megabytes on the hard drive. And I don't know how that happened. I am running a couple of other programs that would take up a lot of memory otherwise, but I tend to run out of like memory very fast on this computer, and I just need a new computer. Honestly, it's not the fault of BitCurator. It's not the fault of our IT people, because it's basically me. And I'm not going to take the blame for that just yet. I'm going to blame the hardware. So so for me, it has just been getting the environment set up just right. And I think like the sort of overarching major roadblock is just the learning curve on, if you've never interacted, in a command line environment, a lot of the programs can be kind of unapproachable. I'm lucky to have kind of grown up in a time where everything was done in the command line. So I'm like somewhat familiar, even though it is a completely different operating system. But that's sort of the biggest, I think, roadblock, especially when I try to onboard other archivists to use it. It can be very intimidating, despite being in Ubuntu, which is very user friendly. All of the other programs that are within the suite, though, can be again intimidating if you don't have sort of specific walkthrough steps or know what it is that you're trying to achieve. At the end of the whole process, sort of as we were saying earlier.
Yeah, this was not in my original questions, but your responses have made me think about the realities of setting this kind of system up within government IT environment. It's just, it's also been one of the roadblocks for us too, of convincing them to have a virtual machine or a dedicated workstation or anything like that can be a major concern. Okay, starting with Tara, we've kind of touched on this in your previous responses, but I'm just still asking again. Are there tools that you use every time? Like, are there ones that, I mean, like, we've already had shout outs and things like that, but just like, this is the one, this is my go-to, this is the most useful.
Yeah, so we've written it again, like we wrote into our workflow, or like how we process collections. So if we are not processing a collection immediately, we will just run it through ClamTK, so like a virus checker. And then we bag for later processing. But again, we're still a fairly new program that we don't really have a backlog. So this is just kind of like something we've written that we will do moving forward when we know that we can't process everything almost immediately. But so right now, or when we are, when we get to the point of processing, we are running Brunhilde, as I said, from the GUI. Through that, we are able to scan for viruses, run to create the hash algorithm, the SHA-256 hash for each file, and we run bulk extractor all through Brunhilde to kind of get that done. We use bulk reviewer to check for PII, mainly because we like the reports that it generates. I know bulk extractor also creates some reports, but we find the bulk reviewer ones to be easier for our collection management team to read. So we give our collection management team the Brunhilde report with the file manifest and the bulk reviewer report. So they have those things. We also use GuyMagger for disk imaging if needed, and then also, as Krista had mentioned, the LibreOffice suite has been great for opening up some different file extensions. So I think that's pretty much everything we are using at this point. Again, we're using it in a very minimal way, but it's a big part of what we do. Grant?
Yeah. So like you, I also use ClamTK just about every single time, but that's kind of the only one that I use every single time, because for us, like each like each batch of things that we have to do in BitCurator is just like a little bit different. We have just a kind of a wide variety of different things that we get. So sometimes it'll just be a PST. We haven't gotten an entire hard drive yet, but if we did, first stop would probably be BitCurator to image it, and using Imager to, you know, grab the whole ISO or whatever format we end up using. But then again, like we also use Brunhilde and Bulk Reviewer. I have like some issues with Bulk Reviewer, just like constantly finding PII that isn't PII, and I need to like maybe adjust the regex for like how it finds credit card numbers specifically, because it finds credit card numbers in links all the time. Just it's like a URL and it just has a bunch of numbers. Um, and you know, again, like read PST is also very good, but we only have to use that when we actually have PSTs. I've also been looking into SSDeep, which is it's a fuzzy hash identifier. I just started reading about it a couple weeks ago, and I haven't had a chance to actually use it, but it would be great for identifying duplicates within the file system, but basically hashing all of the files and then finding where there are like specific groupings of the same kinds of information. So if you have like multiple revisions on a document, you can sort of find all of the ones that are similar and keep those together if necessary. But I haven't figured that workflow out yet, so I will not go into that. There was one other. Yeah, I think that's about it for every time that I sort of open it up and use. Those are the ones. Kristen?
Yeah, so I think again, because I'm using it sporadically and intentionally, it's probably LibreWriter's command line, because I'm going in there exactly to convert these files that I've extracted and gotten from like my other regular workflows and everything. So that's one I usually go to a lot. And like I said, I've played around with Read PST, and then just recently I had to open up HFS Explorer, which again is another kind of disk imager and like disk reviewer type application. So we had external hard drives that had been formatted to a Mac, and then of course we're not playing nicely with our Windows machines that we have. And so hooking it up to the virtual environment in BitCurator, I was able to actually like see, yes, what's on here, and yes, get things off of it and work with it that way. So that was really helpful. And then I actually use bulk extractor in a Windows environment. And so it is a tool, it's been mentioned a couple of times already in BitCurator, and I know it would work probably even better if I kept it in BitCurator in the Linux version. But I do use bulk extractor in the Windows environment. So I wanted to mention that as well. That's about it.
Okay, Grant. On the opposite side, what tools or aspects of, you know, you tried it out and you're like, this is not useful for me, or I don't have a use case for something like this, or it's just too difficult that it's just not feasible.
Yeah, I get really excited anytime that I read the documentation and I see FiWalk. It looks like, and I think there's another one. It's something like HR something. Krista can probably no, okay. um, and there's a couple of utilities that I see like that are maybe they were like I feel like originally they were GUI and then they just had the command line version. And one of those was something that actually went through the entire file directory and gave you stats on every single file and folder. And of course, my phone is ringing right now as I'm talking. But every time I try to use FiWalk, I cannot figure out exactly how to get an output or how to use the features that it's that's being boasted. But I'm still interested, and it could just be that I need to spend 10 minutes instead of 5 minutes reading the documentation, actually playing around with it. But as Krista mentioned earlier, there's not always time to like just sort of have a to actually just find time to cut out time to play around in the environment when I'm trying to get maybe a couple of other things done, or just the program sort of tied together itself. So I don't know if that actually answers the question or not, but there we go. That's me.
So I think I've alluded to it multiple times. I don't really use many of the forensic tools, despite this being the purpose of BitCurator, and not to brag or anything, but it's because I have tools outside of it that are on my Windows machines that I can use and do many of the same things. But again, sitting here listening to both Tara and Grant talk about Brunhilde, which is another one that gets mentioned all the time when you're in the BitCurator community, like everyone's using it. And it's like an all-in-one thing. It's like, yeah, maybe we should be using it a bit more, or, that type of thing. I also think too, just like as part of the BitCurator community, or like listening to folks who use it as well, there's that divide or that question of like, do you need to disk image everything or not? And many of these tools are meant for that. And we are not disk imaging everything that comes through the door. And I'm really only disk imaging the stuff that that's the only way I can get to some of the files on this piece of media, or usually a piece of media, right? So it, maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong, but because I'm not doing those sorts of steps, I'm not using the forensics tools, the imaging tools, the many of the other tools that are on there to their full advantage, just because they don't really fit into our workflows at this time. Could change. I have all those tools externally right now, but there's many of them that I just hop between, and maybe if I switch to BitCurator, that would be better and just all in one type thing. And maybe one day we can't pay for some of those tools, because some of those tools are paid things that we have, but maybe one day our budget's not going to support that. So BitCurator right now is here, it's basically free. It's I can use it, I can fall back on it. So it's good to know that I have it. I need to play with it more, but yeah, there are certain aspects of it that I'm not using to the full advantage just because it doesn't fit our workflows. Tara?
There are just so many tools in BitCurator as well that, and tools that will do the same thing. So there's just so many things in BitCurator to figure out. The one that we gave up with fairly quickly was the bagging tool that BitCurator has built in with it, which again, command line, not doing command line. So we just ended up downloading Dart onto the computer to have something that was easier to bag our files with, because the bagging tool that they had, we kept running it in the command line, and that was the one where we're like, isn't it supposed to do something? And we never could get it to bag properly, that we gave up with it. So that was the main one that we were just kind of we tried it for a while, it didn't work, and so we gave up. But there are so many other tools in BitCurator, and as Grant and Krista both mentioned, it's just finding time to figure out maybe there are other programs that work better for what we want to do. It's just we figured out how to use these and we feel comfortable with them right now, so we're going to keep using them. When things break, when things aren't supported anymore, we'll have to cross that bridge. But right now, those 2 or 3 programs we're using are working great. So that's what we're going to keep using.
Okay, thank you. I always like to hear both what's really great and then also just this is not useful. So circling back to Krista, which she will have a lot to speak about since she's heavily involved, but I want to hear from all of you about your experiences with the BitCurator user community, the consortium, how plugged in, how, what have you found, kind of goes back to also what you found the most useful resources, but just discussions of the user community.
Yeah, so obviously we're BitCurator consortium members, which I've mentioned a couple times, and I was on the executive council and part of D&T. So fairly involved, but I'm also not blind to its pitfalls and why it may or may not be great for state archives. Granted, a lot of the membership is universities, and that's great and good to have those communities too. But as we all know, state archives have their own unique problems and scale and issues, right? And I also acknowledge that the community and the consortium with the community calls and things like that is more of a social space than technical and technical user support. And that, you know, by relying on volunteer labor to keep everything going, including maintaining and updating the environment itself and the documentation, it, you know, lags behind what users might actually need. So acknowledging all that. And before I got involved as part of, you know, being on the executive council, like I didn't get it, like at all. And why members were so pro the community, and like I would attend some of the community calls and I'm like, that's great, but I still don't know how to use BitCurator. How do I do this? And that, again, the return on investment for state archives may not be there for folks to be full members. But like last year, the executive council held some town halls and received feedback that like administrations may be willing to pay for BCC membership if it meant paying for specific services and support, along with like other software models and things like that. And it may head that direction, it might not, because again, it's that balance between you want to keep it open source. So if you start charging for something, is it still that? Is it, do you want to give it away for free? But if it leads to more support for the tool, is that better? It's, you know, it's a whole thing that's being discussed and being worked through and worked on. But I'll also say that for me personally, the membership gave me opportunities for professional development and networking. On top of, we're funding the resource, we're funding like the small amount of like BitCurator continuing on, maybe having, you know, money to keep the maintenance up to like go that direction. So as part of the executive council, I felt like I got great professional development experience being on a committee. I was treasurer of that too, like learning how to be a treasurer, because I don't necessarily get those opportunities in my day-to-day work life, things like that. So like there were other reasons for me personally that it has worked out. But I acknowledge it's not going to be the tool for everyone. And I also acknowledge, and to be fully transparent, which they are being right now as well, that they are currently going through disruption of operations in this last year, and that they're seeking out new fiscal hosts and looking at ways to be more sustainable for ensuring software maintenance. And it's taken a long time for document and training to get the documentation updated, like acknowledged. So, but I think everyone who's on the executive council, past, present, future, acknowledges these things as well. Fully understand that it might not be a fit for everyone. But for now, we're gonna continue to be members of the community. So those are my 2 cents. Tara?
So Krista, you like summarized that so well, but like that is also the reason. So we had originally joined the BitCurator consortium, and that was the reason I kind of let it lapse, was the fact that I didn't feel like I was contributing to the community. So I didn't feel like I should continue to be in that space, because I didn't feel like I knew how to use BitCurator enough to join the documentation committee or to do some of these kind of other things. I did feel that it was very academically focused, which again, it was. The one really great thing that the consortium did offer was a very high level overview of your workflow. And we lucked out because Krista actually was on that call with us. So as you know, we were kind of talking through our workflow and having other people kind of rip it apart and tell us like what we should be doing and, you know, what we could be doing better, different tools we could be using. We also had Krista, who was at least there to advocate and be like, well, that's not exactly how we do things in state archives, which I think is also very different. So I did find that helpful. The other thing Krista had mentioned was the BitCurator Forum, so their conference that they do once a year. I found that to be helpful as a space to be in. They do this great session called No Stupid Questions, and you can really like ask anything anonymously, or you can attach your name to it. But that's been great to kind of get feedback or to get questions answered in kind of a safe space. I live close enough to they do satellite locations, so they'll get together and kind of have a watch party since it is online. And so I was able to attend those, which was helpful because I was actually able to meet a few other people in person who work at institutions in my area who are also using BitCurator for me to talk to. So it was helpful to make contacts there. But we did decide to step away from the consortium for right now, because I just didn't feel like I could contribute to that community in the same way. And I feel like it seems like it's very big on it being you being part of this community. Like, and I didn't feel like I was part of it. So we let that lapse. Grant?
Yeah, and we're not part of the consortium either. I've met up with a bunch of folks at different conferences, and we've, all gotten together and sort of chatted about everything. I think the last one I went to was at COSA in DC last year. And I also do watch like the YouTube streams that they do from, I guess, the forums. They put up, I guess, maybe a month or so later. If not, they might actually be live. I can't remember now. But those are all really helpful, and just hearing, how people are actually using BitCurator is nice, and sort of seeing how people run into a problem and then do workarounds to fix it. And it's not even necessarily a fault of BitCurator. It's just the tools are open-ended. You can do kind of whatever you want with them, and that's a strength. And I think one of the hardest things to get over when you're trying to implement a process, because there isn't one. So just like recognizing that there's, a lot of people doing very different things and different methods of, of appraisal, or, just processing of electronic records in general is helpful. A lot of times I think we as archivists, especially in electronic records, get stuck in thinking like, oh, we're doing everything wrong. Like I'm not doing any of this right. But the truth is, I don't think anybody is. So, or of course, there are people that are, doing things to a very extreme sort of level because they have the, resources and whatever else, and they can spend that time doing it, and that's great. But the reality is, you can sort of pick what you want, and sort of connecting with the BitCurator community through either the forums or through the Google forums, the actual forums, or just like reading through their documentation, I think is really, really helpful. So that's been my experience.
Okay, we only have about 6 minutes left, so I want to open it if people want to ask Q&A, ask any questions. I see Bonnie's comment, the learning curve has been a challenge. Is there any way SERI can help flatten this curve for you and for our state and territorial archives community generally? I mean, I feel like this discussion is the beginning, but is there anything else that would be that SERI could help fill that gap?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like you said, Rachel, this is a good start. I think us three having these different perspectives and use cases is a good way to start. I also think that some of the communities that already exist, like the Archivists Who Code, could also help out with this, because, we we can get together, ask these questions, like be like, again, to Grant's point, like I sometimes feel like I'm doing things wrong because it's like, I'm not bagging things. So Tara's like, yeah, we bag it. I was like, and it's crossed my mind another day too. I was like, am I supposed to be bagging things? I'm not bagging things. I'm doing that wrong. I don't know. I can't remember. It's fine. It's fine. And I just tell myself it's fine. And it is fine. It is. It's not a big deal. But it's one of those things of like just being able to have spaces, I think is one good step to do this because it is a steep learning curve. And yeah, that's my 2 cents there.
You're totally right, Krista. Like, it's the fact that we can, like, I'm very curious about your, like, Libra writing, the code that you're using we're gonna have to talk about that in Archivists Who Code, because I want to know what you're doing for that. And I think that that's, having the SERI community and being able to pull a lot of those resources together, because again, we do things that are so different from our colleagues in academic settings that sometimes it does also feel like we are doing it wrong because we're doing it differently than how most of the other people are doing it.
And not to cut in Grant, but I'm going to. But also Tara, like you guys putting out your workflows with the backer grant is going to be super helpful too to see, since you have baked in the use of BitCurator. It'll be good for us to for me to review to see and like make my own judgments that way. But then I'll let Grant chime in.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I got distracted by the next question a little bit. But I was just gonna say that the other thing too is that there isn't just like one learning curve. Like I feel like with BitCurator, you plateau for a bit and you go, oh, okay, I'm really comfortable with all this, and then you go, wait a second, there's like 10 other things I could or should be doing. And I want to just remind everyone that like BitCurator 2 is is a good like starting point for like maybe even developing your own tools or workflows to do things. And there's like a lot of different avenues after you even get the basics down. So but I think even just having a baseline session on what is BitCurator, what are the tools that we have been talking about, would be good for at some point in the future. And to sort of immediately, well, I don't know, I'll let you handle it, Rachel.
No, that's fine. You can get in. So next question was from Christopher about false positives for PII detection and what have been the capabilities of BitCurator? Is that the primary detection, PII detection that you're using? We always are worried about PII and trying to figure it out. So any discussions of those?
I'll say that like for me, it's a starting place. It's not, I don't love it. I don't think the output is, great, but it is definitely a first step for me. And I don't have a good alternative other than just using my eyeballs and, some very specific text strings searches. But I'll hand it off to somebody else.
No, you're on it, Grant. That's kind of what it is. I know through some of the BitCurator forum talks, people have talked about various other codes and things they've written to try to identify things around, specifically like student ID numbers, and like there have been very specific things that institutions have done. So there are some videos I know from previous forums that may be helpful. But again, it goes back to just like who has the time to like write a whole new code to look very specifically for these things. So yeah, it kind of is the starting point, and we're gonna just try our best, which is all we can do.
And I know we're getting close to time. I'll just chime in that it's echoing everything that's been said, but also trying to rely on the agencies that have transferred stuff to us to also identify where it should be, so that if I do get something that doesn't look right, or if it seems like there should be something going on there, I take a closer look at those spaces. That it is, yes, there's this tool, it's a good starting point, but also need to like do some follow-up and checking, which can be helped out by agencies helping you out a little bit if they're good. So just adding that into. Rely on your agencies, as annoying as it can be sometimes.
Yeah, I know we're bumping on time, but if I had kind of one last question to kind of wrap it all up. Because this is also why I kind of want it, because every time I've kind of dipped into the BitCurator space, it does feel very academic, and it feels very like, oh, we're disk imaging everything. We have all the time in the world to learn all these tools, and that's just not reality in my institution situation. So my kind of like final question, kind of wrap up, is like, what do you think a state archives user should know with this system? Because like that's what we're trying to share. That's why SERI is stepping in. Like, what do you think is like a state archives user? Like, and also like issues with IT and setup within government IT situations. Just like kind of key things that you have found useful.
I don't know who's supposed to start, so I'm going to jump in. I think that knowing what your IT limitations are is good. If I knew that I was not going to have any support, I think this is probably where we would have ended up, but I probably would have done a few more things to get here. And to feel a little bit more comfortable in the space, but that's not what it is. And so kind of just knowing what the limitations are and knowing how much support you're going to get from your colleagues, but also from IT is kind of good. Knowing if you're going to have administrative access to be able to update the computer or update your things as needed, or are you stuck? So just kind of those questions to kind of ask yourself.
And I think that so like we have an offline computer that it's totally air gapped, as it were. And we had to develop some processes for updating it offline, especially with the antivirus. And that's actually something I do have to do every single time I log into BitCurator. But like having that set up and knowing just like the bare bones part of the process of like how you get updates on the computer or into the environment, knowing that ahead of time is really helpful, I think, when talking to IT, especially just like in your case, Tara, like they're like, oh, but we have to send updates because we want to make sure everything is like within the right parameters or whatever, and we can monitor the activity. And just you have to maybe explain to them that is part of the security of it, is to keeping everything off the network so that you don't have some kind of infection or whatever. But again, like it being, I don't know, there's a lot of things, but just know like that, just try to work, I guess, with your IT people, to get, and like, just don't try to hide anything from them, I guess is what I would say. That's sort of the advice I would, and get used to failure, or just a sort of expect it. Approach the entire suite of programs with a certain amount of respect. If you go in very full of yourself and you think you're doing everything right, you're absolutely not. You're probably just getting lucky, Krista.
Yeah, I think I'm echoing that. In planning for this question, I was like, your IT won't know what you're doing, why you need it, or how to run it. So be prepared for it. And you might not know what you're doing, why you need it, or how to run it either. Like and be okay with that. Like it's fine. Also, just listening to like some of these conversations as well, like it's going to be on a separate computer, whether that's hooked up to the network separate, like Grant was saying, just a virtual machine, it's probably going to be another computer. So like knowing your IT limitations, if you can have more than one machine, is probably a good like first step. Because we just did a major IT transition here, and during that everyone was like, we're supposed to only go down to one machine per person. I'm a special case because I do have my fancy like BitCurator like processing machine with like the higher RAM and like all the other like better computing and things like that, but it's to do my job, right? So knowing that you're going to have to make that case to your IT or what the limitations are, and just be comfortable with not really feeling like you get it, like that you might be doing something wrong, that I don't know how to use all the tools. you know, be comfortable just like not even looking at some of the tools. Like it's completely fine. It's a whole environment and suite of tools for you to do what you need to do, and you don't have to use all of them. If you just use the one, that's fine. You know, you're using it, it's good. So just like Grant said, be comfortable with the failure, the not knowing, the like learn as you go growth experience. Like it's good.
All right, thanks. Thank you guys. And we are over, so I'm going to wrap us up. I just also want to point out to stay connected with SERI and with COSA. Here's our links to our social channels. Thank you so much to our panelists for sharing their experiences. Thank you for all of us for joining and having questions. And I hope you will join us in October for our Electronic Records Day program. Thanks all.